Mr. Waldman, thank you for coming to Berlin.
My pleasure.
It was a pleasure having you here and listening to your speech yesterday. I'm going through a few questions, really generally trying to know you a little bit better and a little bit more in depth. And I will start to ask you if you could tell us something more about your professional background, so how you got into osteopathy and where you studied and so on.
It was by chance. I had no knowledge of what osteopaths were. I had no knowledge of the profession. I was about to leave to live in Israel as a 19-year-old and wanting only one thing, which is to be a communist with a small c, which means to live on a kibbutz, to be a farmer in a communal settlement with very high socialist ideals. My parents wisely pointed out that other members of the family had done that in the past, and over the years had become disillusioned and had to leave the kibbutz, but did not have a profession to fall back on. So they strongly suggested that I find a profession, train first in a profession, and if worse came to worse, I would fall back on that profession in Israel if I left the kibbutz. And I had no idea what it was I would want to do as a profession until one day a very close relative suggested osteopathy and that her brother was being treated successfully, and why didn't I investigate it? I went down to the local library to look up what is osteopathy and discovered that one of the only 2 schools in the whole of Britain happened to be 5 minutes walk away from where I lived in the centre of London. I thought this was an incredible coincidence. I didn't have an excuse to tell my parents why I shouldn't discover more about the profession. It was just too easy. And I went to the college and I met, it was during the summertime, so it was closed, but the registrar lived in the college and he was happy to talk to me, and the discussion went on for 2 hours, and he became one of the most important men in my life as a teacher. I was fascinated by what he said, and I thought, well, I'd like to try. And they were especially kind. They had a principle which was that in the first year, if the student became disillusioned or unhappy, they could leave and they would get the fee that they paid back, but for the number of months that they had been already in the college, which I thought was very fair.
And this was back in?
This was back in 1969. Yeah.
So I understood you worked back in the UK, back in England, many years with John Wernham.
Yes.
So we can almost consider you being part of the second generation of osteopaths down the Little John line.
Yes.
And very much representing what we have been calling in England the classical osteopathic approach. Mm. Can you tell us about your experience with John Wernham?
I was ready to give up osteopathy in my 3rd year of studies. I thought it was rubbish. I thought it was unscientific. I thought my teachers were hypocrites. They were saying one thing and they were showing something very different on the table. They were talking beautifully, but what I saw them do on the table was terrible. And their explanations were terrible. Until one day John Wernham decided to teach at this college. He came in and gave my class a lesson. And the lesson consisted of reading from Little John's notes, which I couldn't understand, nor did anyone else understand, for about 3/4 of the lecture. And then for the last quarter, he took one of the students as a model and began to treat the student. It was one of those important moments in one's life. And for me, it changed my understanding and appreciation of what is the potential of osteopathy. I couldn't understand what he was doing on the table, but it looked aesthetically so beautiful. And for the first time, I saw somebody taking the whole body as a unit, both examining and entreating, something that all the lecturers were talking about, but never showing on the table. He took, within the 15 to 18 minutes of the work he did on the patient, the whole body, carefully, precisely, rhythmically, as a dance. He was making that body dance under his fingers. That caused me to want to learn more and to stay as close to this man as possible, which I did as a student and then as a postgraduate.
we understood that you managed to bring this type of work into hospital. Can you tell us more about your hospital work? Because you are, compared to the European osteopaths who do not have that easy access to hospitals, someone who is actually dedicating much of his professional life to hospital work.
That came about because while I saw John Wernham treat some very sick and very disabled patients, I still felt the most difficult patients were likely to be seen in a hospital setting. And I still, when I left for Israel, after being already 15 years in practice, could not say that I could truly prove to myself that osteopathy worked, as opposed to the placebo effect. And I felt the only place I could try to prove that to myself was in a hospital setting. So as soon as I arrived in Israel, and I had very little work, I had a good reason to look for hospital work, where at least some of my week I would be employed, but also gather the experience that I wanted, try the trial that I wanted to try, which was, does osteopathy work at the hospital bedside with really sick patients? And that's why I began to look for hospital work. And from the beginning, for the past 27 years since I've been in Israel, I've divided my week in half. Half the week in hospital, roughly, half the week in my own private practice.
Which is very much what probably old osteopaths used to do every day.
Probably, yeah.
And
I believe that there's no reason why it can't be done in Europe or in Britain.
Yeah.
Because I think if you make a little effort, you'll find a niche in most hospitals today. Osteopathy has a good name, which it didn't have back 30 years ago.
Yeah, but apparently it doesn't work that easy, for example, within the NHS or within the English reality. So you were, however,
it doesn't mean that in private practice, if you're willing to work as a general practitioner, as a family physician, you won't have the opportunity, if you look for it, to treat very sick patients. You can start with your own family, your own children, your own parents and grandparents, all of whom get ill at some time, with infections, with fevers, with degenerative diseases of some serious note sometimes, and treat them within your own clinical setting or within their homes if necessary.
You were talking yesterday about osteopathy, talking about the revolution of osteopathy, which I found very interesting, as we can talk about the evolution of our profession over the past 100 and odd years, but also about the revolution. So could you please define the osteopathic revolution?
I meant to say that there was a revolution when Little John decided to break with Still. He decided, or Still and he decided they could not live together under the same roof. And Little John saw the complexity of illness and disease and saw that treatment required far more than just looking for osteopathic lesions. He recognized the importance, the essential importance of lifestyle factors in helping the body recover. And that placed him on a different pedestal to Still. And that was revolutionary at the time. It remained revolutionary until about 10 or 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when the first piece of truly scientific research came through under Dr. Dean Ornish, O-R-N-I-S-H, an American cardiologist who began to publish the first of a series of results of his trials with, firstly, patients with severe atheroma of the coronary artery, and following that, more recently, patients with early-stage prostate and breast cancer. And his results were outstanding. The medical profession has been to this day shocked that people could recover without medication and without invasive treatments, just by, I say just in inverted commas because it's a lot of work, changing lifestyle factors from very carefully controlled diets to meditation to the right kind of exercise at the right time, as the three basic pillars on which he places his work. Little John was saying that 120 years ago, well, 100 years ago, and being ridiculed and being ostracized and being excommunicated by Still for doing so. But he stuck to his beliefs, as did those who followed him, and he brought those to Britain, where he developed the school that continued for many years. And my teacher, John Wernham, and his teacher, Edward Hall, and colleague, who I, again, was very lucky to learn under for the last 4 years of his life, tried very hard to keep that alive, against all the reaction of colleagues who didn't like the idea of osteopaths being physicians. They were frightened that they would not be accepted by the medical community, and they didn't want the responsibility either of being called at night, of having to treat at the most odd hours, of having the responsibility of really sick people on your hands. It's much easier, and you can make a lot of money just treating back pains. And they get better most of the time anyway, if you wait long enough. So why bother with all this responsibility and all the learning you have to be an osteopathic physician? And unfortunately, that's still today.
How do you see the future of our profession, and do you have any suggestions for the next generations? You have to think now that you are probably in the same position John Wernham was when you...
Yes, almost exactly the same age when I first met him.
There you go.
I have very sad thoughts when I think of the potential loss that could happen over the next 2 decades if this core of classical osteopathy is lost. And it can be lost very easily because it requires a lot of effort to learn it and to practice it. And the numbers are very few that are drawn to it beyond the initial interest. And therefore it's going to remain, I believe, on a very, very thin line between surviving or disappearing. It's on that line at the moment. I play a small part in an institute to keep it alive. And we run postgraduate courses, we try to keep it as high a level as possible, and we travel all over the world to develop the approach. But it's still on this very, very thin line, because there is a human element that you cannot control for, and that is the fact that it requires an immense investment in your own time and energy to learn it, to become good at it, and to practice it. And the human element is always tending towards making life easier, taking shortcuts, not taking responsibility. So it's a factor that is very worrying. Can it stay alive, given those difficulties?
And any suggestions for the next generations? What shall they do?
There's only one thing that can keep it alive. Does it inspire the next generation the way it inspired me? I don't see any other way.
So let's hope in a lot of inspiration.
I hope so.
Many thanks for your time.
Pleasure.